Hello everyone and welcome to my YouTube channel. My name is Praful Raj and I'm excited to launching this channel where I will be interviewing some of the amazing guests from the field of economics. So today our guest is Dr. Badri Narayanan Gopalakrishnan. So he serves NITI Aayog Government of India as a fellow, wherein he headed the verticals of trade and commerce, strategic economic dialogue, international cooperation, and a vision for 2047. He has founded a consulting firm named Infinite Sum Modeling in 2015, which has a global presence in India, US, UK, Canada, and among other countries. He has extensive experience as an economist analyzing policies related to international trade, disruptive technology, environment, labor, and public health. He has informed major economic policies through his academic research and consulting project with organizations such as United Nations, World Trade Organization, World Bank, and IMF. He has also been engaged with startups community as an advisor and co-founder and has published over 150 papers and 8 books in reputed journals. So today we will talk about global trade, like what is free trade, what is protectionism, and how the policy that impacts India in relation to global world. So I would like to welcome you, sir, and thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Praful. Nice to be talking to you.
Yeah, great. And before we get to the series of questions, I would just like to give a brief introduction of our to our audience so that the audience can better understand your answer, sir. So basically, the free trade is nothing but an economic policy that promotes open market, free flow of goods and services with a minimal intervention of government in trade. Of course, it depends on the sector to sector, like defense, healthcare, it's a different thing. One of the earliest proponent of free trade was the Scottish economist, which every economics student knows is Adam Smith, who is in famous work and the book His Wealth of Nation has talked about the free trade and rather than protectionism and the trade barrier, we should go for free trade. Fast forwarding in the post World War II era, the Bretton Woods system established a rule-based international economic system that encouraged free trade and the growth of global economy. In October 1947, the General Agreement of Tariff and Trade, that known as GATT, was signed by 23 nations and which later evolved into the World Trade Organization, which played an important role in promoting free trade by reducing tariff and other barriers among the countries. So today we'll talk about the free trade and protectionism, and it remains a controversial issue. Some supporters argue that it's promote the economic growth. Some critics argue that it's not good for our internal businesses to grow and etc. and etc. So this is the brief introduction. So our first question to you. So basically, how do you see this trend of protectionism, which is exact the opposite of free trade? It's not nothing in between, and both in terms of global economics and Indian context. With this question, I'll just put another small question to it. Also, we know that protectionism is important because allow internal businesses to grow and unemployment to a mid-sector organization, MSME, and everything. So, do you think this is also because of geopolitical differences between the countries, like what we saw with China and US, and between the Russia, US, and European countries because of the Ukraine and Russia war? So, here to you, sir.
Yeah, no, that's a great introduction and nice question you have asked. And it's a very pressing question in the minds of a lot of policymakers, politicians, economists across the world. So, like you rightly said, for a long time, so free trade has been the main kind of approach that has been advocated by a lot of economists, including Adam Smith, like you mentioned. But in the last few years, particularly, I mean, if you go back to like 50 years ago, during GATT, like you said, when GATT was started and then WTO and so on, the push was coming mainly from the developed countries to open up and reduce tariffs, reduce non-tariff barriers and so on. And the developing countries would mostly be defensive in terms of protectionism. Whereas in the last few years, if you start from around 10 years ago, the tide is changing. So the developed countries are becoming more and more protectionist, while the developing countries are getting more and more integrated with the rest of the world. So it is partly because of two things, conceptual things that have happened. One is the developed countries are realizing how much the trade, free trade has limitations in terms of uh, you know fostering the domestic production, domestic employment, and so on. So basically, if you get into too much of a free trade kind of policies, then your domestic industry is totally displaced by imports. So that is on the developed country side. On the developing country side, they started realizing the benefits of free trade. So, so we have been all pushing. If you take India, for example, we have been pushing very hard at the WTO to have a multilateral, rules-based international trading system where everyone gets participated in it, and then you have a consensus in terms of what should be the trading system. So India has been always pushing for that, and India has been taking a leadership among the developing countries to do that. So and now the WTO has a lot of concerns because of the lack of consensus between the developed and developing countries. And also many countries are starting their own regional trade agreements, preferential trade agreements, free trade agreements, and so on. And India has been staying away from that. India still believes in the multilateral trading system, and but then with the whole world moving in that direction, like you said, on one hand you are negotiating specific free trade agreements with specific countries.
Yes.
On the other hand, you are closing your doors generally to other kinds of imports. So getting into some kind of regional uh, blocks of trading blocks and so on. So I think geopolitics definitely has a role to play, like you said. So far I was explaining the first part of your question about why protectionism is increasing globally, and your second question of geopolitics, and that's very important. Everything boils down to politics and geopolitics, and we should also remember that politics is not a kind of an independent discipline. Politics also depends on economics.
Yes.
So why did protectionism rise in the Western world in the recent years? Because you can say it's because of politics. But why did that political change happen? Because people at large started, complaining about lack of jobs. Like in the US, if you take, for example, a lot of the manufacturing jobs were moved to China and Mexico and so on. So the people are frustrated about trade. So I think geopolitics is a driver for all these things, but then underlying that is still economics. So economics drives the politics and geopolitics, and that is how all these changes are happening. But I would also think of this as a course correction. So you may, I'm a believer in a pragmatic trade policy. I'm not completely into free trade. You need to have free trade in many sectors, which is going to benefit the domestic economy. But if you have sectors where you have clear competition, wherein if you open up the trade, you're going to wipe out the domestic industry, where there is some level of comparative advantage. You may not have the best competitiveness, but you have some competitiveness. So then when you have competition from imports, you'll be wiped out. So I think you need to have a pragmatic trade policy. You have to be open to trade wherever you can, and you should be protectionist wherever it is needed. But then problem is that people are getting either on the either extremes. Either you go complete free trade, then you suffer, and then you blame trade policy itself that it's not working. But basically, we have to be very pragmatic. That's
Great.
thought
So in
process.
your answer, sir, there are two, three things I would like to mention. First, you talked about like how developed countries going towards protectionism and developing country into the more of a free trade. And second, you talk about the lack of consensus with the WTO within the many countries. So that's why they are, doing their own agreement between the countries. And the third, you talked about that politics is only possible when there is economic growth. Like, they are interrelated, they cannot go in silos, right? Like, there is economy, then there is politics, there's politics, then there is economy. So I'll emphasize on one question that you talk about the lack of consensus among the countries, like which WTO is facing. So if you could just briefly explain like what kind of lack of consensus that WTO is facing among the countries, like top two three reasons among them.
Yeah, actually, there are several issues there. One primary area is agricultural sector. The developing countries want the developed countries to reduce their subsidies, which are huge. And the developed countries want the developing countries to reduce tariffs. So there is this discussion between on tariff versus subsidy, who should reduce what and so on. So that is one major issue for every country. Agriculture is a sensitive issue, so they want to protect, and that is stopping the progress. Second issue is uh, the the recent issue about the dispute settlement mechanism. So we have this dispute settlement mechanism which has been quite effective in WTO to be very fair and transparent in terms of awarding judgments to different countries in the case of disputes. But recently it has been the appellate body has been non-functional, and the developing countries want to developing countries and even some of the developed countries like EU and so on, they want that to come back. But then some other countries like US are not very keen. They think that this is kind of eroding their sovereignty. They call this when you have a dispute settlement mechanism outside the country's jurisdiction, then you are going to be like politically and from a domestic government point of view, it's difficult for them. Although it has been already agreed upon, it has been there. Now some of these countries are raising concerns and they are not being very supportive. And then there are many other issues like there is an issue of e-commerce, digital trade. What should be the regulations there? How much can we tax them and so on? Right now there are no taxes. You cannot tax the cross-border digital transmissions. But countries like India and South Africa and so on, they are asking that we should be able to tax them. Then we have issues like labor standards, environmental standards. So these should be part of trading system. That has been the argument of countries like the US and EU, and countries like India and China are saying, no, this is not possible. We cannot be impose standards from outside. That is a domestic policy. So basically, fundamentally, if you take in all these concerns, it's a tension between domestic policy and trade policy.
Okay.
So every country has its own domestic policy. They don't want their domestic policy to be disturbed by the trade policy, and that is why you have all this tension. And I don't see any major consensus or solution happening in the near future because these are perennial problems. Of course, but WTO still has served its purpose. It is serving its purpose of pushing countries to reduce their tariffs, greater free trade, greater transparency. At least now the countries can speak about what other countries are doing. We have the trade policy review and all these things, right? So, yeah, so that's the broad set of issues involved in WTO.
Oh, yeah. So yeah, we agree that they are a very perennial issue that has been going on, which probably it cannot be solved. I don't think so. It will be solved 100%, but yes, from that, few things will work, few things will not work. Probably. So now, going back to your second question, relation to since you mentioned about the differences among domestic policy and the trade policy. So now we will little bit talk about like in India context, in the context of India, like like in global trade, dollar has been one of the dominating currency. Like dollar is, and like the other currency like Chinese currency, then euro is also there. So India even get into the free trade or protectionism. So India will always be importing some of the few important commodities such as natural gas, petrol, and other few products. So, and we see that due to the sanction on Russia by European country and US, freezing their accounts. So India has gone into the phase of little bit of de-dollarization. So, what do you think? Like, for example, like UAE countries are getting, tied up with Indian government for their currency to get in the trade. Then also Russian ruble also took in terms of crude oil. So, what do you think in terms of, Indian rupee coming to the market as a global trade? Do you think any in near future, or it requires much more deliberation and agreement to get into those kind of?
Yeah, this is an area where the government has been very active. RBI has also recently notified that for 18 countries you can have trade in rupees. So these things are kind of happening. But I think there are two issues here. One is that whether rupee will be accepted internationally, That is one thing. And second thing is, what will be the impact of that on the value of rupee, and what would that mean for our trade? So on the first aspect, although the transactions are allowed, it will take a long time before the countries will actively start taking that route, unless there are some incentives. If there are incentives from Indian side to promote trade in rupees, then with Russia it is a no-brainer, because for them, with all the sanctions, for them it makes sense to go in rupees. But with other countries, it's going to take some time. On the second question about the impact on trade itself. Generally, when with these kind of interventions, the demand for rupees may increase over time,
Yeah.
which means that the rupee will appreciate. When
Yeah.
rupee appreciates, then your imports are going to become cheaper and your exports are going to become more expensive.
Yeah.
So what does that mean? We are a trade deficit country. We are an import dependent country, which means that when imports are cheaper, it's going to have a deflationary effect in the economy. We are going to have lower prices, which also means our even our exports may become competitive, because there are a lot of imported inputs coming in. When
Yes.
exports become more competitive, then the price effect on exports will be subdued a little bit. So you have exports becoming more expensive because of exchange rate. At the same time, exports may become cheaper because of the competitiveness from cheaper imports. So the net effect on this can be anything. It is anybody's guess. But traditionally, India's trade policy has been dependent on depreciation. So we always think, if you talk to any industrialist exporter, they would say we want weaker rupee. We want weaker rupee so we can export at a lower price competitively. I think unless we move away from that mindset and point of thinking, perspective of thinking, we may be stuck with that. We may actually suffer when rupee appreciates. But I think the way to go is to focus more on quality upgradation and getting into higher end products, rather than relying on the price advantage. So I think that should be the impact on trade itself. But broadly, it will be a good move, because we do depend a lot on imports. So for people at large, appreciation is always better.
Yeah, so basically, if this happens to some extent in the near future, you say that the trade deficit will come down based on, like,
Yeah. Trade deficit can actually come down, because your imports may go down, and with respect to exports, we don't know how much it will go up or go down. But then, since imports are a big chunk, and if
big
they
chunk.
go down in terms of value, then that can definitely improve our trade deficit.
Yeah, I think let's see what happens with other countries. Like, of course, it requires a technological change and the mindset change with the Indian exporters especially, and to make this happen on a larger scale. Yes, Russia was a no brainer, because there was no option for Russia also, and we also wanted some cheap crude oil, so that actually happened in a very short span of time. Okay, so talking about this technological change, and that import and export, and we know that import and export depends on how well country can produce a good. So in economics, we all have studied the terms called comparative advantage and competitive advantage. So this is what exactly import and export people how think of importing, exporting it. So with this technological change, innovation of transfer of innovation among countries, and labor incentive goods will get cheaper, resulting of use of more of tech. So what do you think, like this the advantage, the comparative advantage will little bit go down, or like there will be no such advantage for such country, and at the end countries will start producing their own? So what's your view on that, and how much time it might take for any country to realize that they are not benefiting from this competitive or comparative advantage, because so much of technological change and the way of doing it? What do you think?
Yeah,
In
absolutely. When you think
terms of
about think about comparative advantage, we always think of various things like cheaper labor, and maybe later on we got some theories like specific factors and so on. But at the end of the day, it boils down to what kind of endowments do you have. With let's say, if you think about a technology like 3D printers. So the
Yeah.
3D printing. So if you are able to 3D print like a major parts of automobiles, or motor vehicles, or even building blocks and so on, then you are actually thinking of a scenario where you don't need a lot of workers, which means the whole thing can be done by a machine. If that is there, then why do you have to import from China? Why do you have to import from Vietnam, Bangladesh, and all these countries? You can actually produce it in your own country. And this kind of thing will happen more and more in the developed countries, particularly because then they can ramp up their production domestically. They'll reduce their dependence on imports. Same thing with the other technologies like AI and so on, where they can be very disruptive. They can ensure that you can do a lot of things without, like, take for example the IT sector. India is a big powerhouse in IT sector because we have very cheap, high quality human resources who can work on softwares. But now with things like ChatGPT and so on, if a lot of code can be generated by the AI, why do you need to employ such people, right? Now we need people to develop things like ChatGPT, not day-to-day C programming and so on. So I think that is going to be a big deal. We are going to see a lot of movement away from the traditional comparative advantage situation to this kind of. I mean, comparative advantage as a fundamental philosophical concept will still be there,
Yeah.
but it won't be the same factors. It won't be, it's not labor, but it may be to some extent capital, but not also specific type of capital. It's not about any capital, but capital going into AI, 3D printing, these kind of things. Whichever country leads the world in terms of being the top front runner in AI, front runner in 3D printing and blockchain and all these technologies, and that country will become like China today. And China is already doing that in keeping the same example, right? China has been doing, being the leader in terms of manufacturing and so on through the traditional comparative advantage, but it has already very quickly moved into technology innovation, R&D. If you look at the Chinese companies now, they're very, very, very advanced, and they're developing many path-breaking technologies. So I think they're already there. So it is quite likely that China can retain its leadership. And if you take countries like US and EU and so on, they're all democracies, so they have a lot of restrictions on how research can be done, how technologies can be developed. So that is playing, in my opinion, to the favor of countries like China and Russia, because there things are done in a different way. There is no democracy, so uh, the government can say this is the technology that has to be developed, and that will be done. Whereas that's not the case in the Western countries and also in India. So I think with all these challenges, we have to come up with technologies, policies, and regulations for technologies in a way that we boost innovation, we boost R&D. At the same time, we take into account the pitfalls. Right now, we are more. If you look at the popular discourse, look at the media and so on, everyone only talks about the ills of technology.
Yes.
Why is technology bad and so on, and how it should be regulated, why the big tech should be regulated and so on. I think there is some element of truth in that, but we should not only focus on that. We should also focus on the positives of it, and actually, if we don't do that, we'll probably get into a greater evil kind of situation where some of these countries which are not responsible, they may get into becoming becoming leaders in this, and then the trade scenario also will get stuck there.
Yeah, so one question which is little bit digress from this topic, since you talked about like Chat GPT taking all kinds of code, like they can code. So what do you think about economics modeling? Like all that modeling that is done in the economics, the microeconomic modeling. Do you think that most of things will be get, you know, through GPT, or it, I mean, of course, any model requires the human intervention, but what about the specific to economics modeling? What do you think?
Actually, it's already happening in the last few years. If you take companies like Amazon, they're doing very state-of-the-art economic modeling using a lot of data analytics, AI, machine learning kind of methods. And now it is pretty much mainstream. Many top universities, they are teaching machine learning for economics, AI for economics, and so on. I mean, even some economists like Raj Chetty, they have made innovations in
Yes.
AI using economics. It's kind of economics and AI are synergistic. Like you might have seen this paper on bias in AI. When you have bias in data, how do you correct it? Using some combination of economics and computer science concepts. So, in one way, the good thing is economics as a discipline has waken up and it is already kind of acting as a collaborator with all these advanced computer science methods. And secondly, even economists are learning all these things, and there are programs like computational economics, computer science and economics. These kind of programs are becoming very popular from the undergrad level till PhD level. So I think these are all positive things, but definitely there is a possibility of automating and getting all this economic modeling done in a kind of automated fashion. I mean, even if you think about it, like think about 30 years ago when I spoke to some very senior person in India who was the chairman of UPSC, and when I spoke to him some 20 years ago, he was a very quantitative economist in his younger days, and he was telling me to run a regression, they had to struggle a lot. They had to take these punch cards and
Yes.
enter the data and so on. And when I was doing a PhD, we already had Stata, we already had R and so on. So we were doing a lot of very complicated algorithms with a statement in Stata and so on. So in economics, this has already happened over time. A lot of very detailed, difficult, comprehensive, rigorous methods have been automated. Somebody who can just Google search and get the code and run, they can
So,
run very complicated regressions. But in future, this can happen even in a greater scale.
but one thing, sir, so to understand, see, it all machine learning always or AI comes into a picture when there is a millions of data set, right? With the millions of numbers. Now, if we talk about especially for the economic indicators and economic, data set, the data set is very, very small in comparison to what AI and machine learning needs that high level of data set, to generate information. For example, you talked about Amazon. So Amazon, so yeah, there are a bunch of economists that Amazon's hires, like we know, and all are PhD candidates almost. All so they worked on the data that Amazon generates on every second, probably, to design their policy, to design. So don't you think it's kind of, yes, a little bit of tech will always be there. Of course, we see so many languages in that, but will it be like economic indicators like microeconomic modeling, DSG modeling? These are we will be entirely automated.
No, actually, there is already a lot of discussion going on about that. And in fact, I've also been part of some of the discussions, even in India.
uh,
Like if you take in India, we have this GST transactions data, which is real-time data that is coming up. And right now, it is not being used for any policy stuff, but it can be potentially used in the future, right? We can get. Why do you have to wait for quarterly GDP forecast?
yes.
You can have daily, you can have weekly, looking at all these data sets, right? So those things are already being discussed in many countries, and because we are capturing all the, particularly in a country like India, with the amount of digital transactions we have, almost. I mean, if you look at the traditional surveys like NSS and so on, they happen once in 2 3 years, and they take a lot of time, collect a lot of
Yeah,
data,
correct. By the time
and
it
it
significant
takes a
count.
and at the end of the day, if you see, I've done worked a lot on NSS data. At the end of the day, if you see, it's a small sample.
Sam.
The sample will be like 1% of the population, and from that 1%, you're going to estimate the population. Now
Yes.
with GST transactions and so on, you capture at least 50%, if not more, and that is as good as population. A lot of people say, okay, these are biased because you're only capturing some part of the population, but I tell them, look at your surveys. The surveys are like only 1%. From 1%, you're extrapolating to the population. If you have
Population.
50%, why shouldn't you be comfortable extrapolating that to the population? So I think that is going to happen. It is already happening in many countries. I think one of the state federal reserves, I think St. Louis or one of them, they have come up with some kind of indicator based on high frequency micro
The
level
high
data set.
frequency, there are many indicators in fact. But so
Yeah.
how India is doing in this aspect? Are they releasing like high frequency indicators very frequently as of now?
No, right now in India, we are still lagging behind in this aspect. We are not doing much. We need to do a lot more.
What?
But at the moment, there are a lot of discussions happening to do that. Internally, there are a lot of such things done internally, but within the government. But publications publication of all these high frequency data sets, it will take some time, but it will happen definitely in the near future.
Okay, okay. So coming back to our original question, so in terms of comparative advantage, you told that, now it will be more of a capital investment. Who does the more capital investment to gain the advantage? So previously it was more of a labor, like wherever there is a cheap labor, like all these countries, Mexico, South Africa, like everyone is manufacturing there, and China is also giving. So the thing is that what specific kind of capital you are talking? Because today also, of course, a country which has more capital, they can of course take an advantage. Like what in what sector, in what ways the capital will actually help to gain, to keep this advantage to their own kitty, like country which is still exporting will continue to export if they invest more.
Yeah, it's mainly R&D type capital, and not only like we're not talking about like academic type R&D where you develop large projects, publish papers and so on, but very practical, like R&D that is directly linked to practical stuff. We also have to have capital for developing hubs for operationalizing R&D findings in the developing countries, in countries like India. In those kind of R&D capital investments should be there. One is R&D, developing R&D itself, and second is applying the R&D findings.
So how is India doing on that? Like how much government is planning to invest or is actually investing, our R&D to keep the industry which is still in our hand of exporting.
Yeah, so we are incentivizing. If you see recently, there is a scheme called production linked incentives, and there a lot of emphasis has been given on products that are highly R&D intensive, like semiconductors, pharmaceuticals, and so on. So a lot of incentives are given for that, and basically, government currently is playing a role of catalyst rather than government itself doing. That's what
Yeah.
happened in the last several decades. The government itself was developing a lot of these R&D stuff, but now it is incentivizing the private companies to do that. And also, you're getting into these partnerships. My second part I mentioned, commercializing the R&D that is
R&D.
already there. So, like the developed countries are developing a lot of, they invest a lot in R&D. They're already very advanced. So, what we can do is we can have partnership with them and say, okay, you have this R&D, but for you producing it is very expensive. We can produce it for you, and have this kind of technology transfer agreements. And it's already happening. It's happening from B2B. Companies that are developing R&D, they are doing it with India, but we can also do it at a government to government level. So, for example, right now we are talking about this green hydrogen, making India a green hydrogen hub. For that, we need a lot of technology transfer from Japan, from EU, from US, and so on. We have been negotiating, discussing with them about it. So many such things are happening, and I've seen also at a very micro level. Like I know somebody here in the US who developed a very new kind of device which can be fixed on the bicycle to make it a e-bike,
E-bike.
and that device is completely made in India. He designed it here, and then he thought that it's cost effective if it is manufactured in India. So he found a factory there. They're making it, and so these kind of things are happening more and more. And also, like we discussed previously about the geopolitical changes,
Yes.
a lot of reshoring and these kind of things are happening. Like things are moving away from countries like China to countries like India. So these are happening. So now the R&D partnership, technology partnerships can accelerate that even more, because it's not like traditional investments that okay, I can manufacture this, I can do it, but it's more like getting into design aspects, R&D aspects, and so on.
Oh, got
So
it. Got it. Hmm. So it's more of R&D and how, how fast India can move in terms of researching and developing it, applying it proper. So now,
yeah,
sir,
more than the first one. R&D is good. We should do it, but we are already quite lagging behind the frontiers already developed in the West and other countries. So I think it will be more effective, more
transfer.
more cost effective and more efficient if we just transfer them and develop. We can position ourselves as a implementer rather than researcher.
Hmm. Now coming back to, since we talked about trade and all, one basic questions like our audience would like to know, like on what broad parameters agreements are done on the country. For example, is it like, like for example, India is having agreement with Russia just because they have a good relationship from decades? Or is it like they really talk about the facts and figures, like, okay, if we do this kind of agreement, India is going to be impacted in a very positive way, and the growth can be seen due to this few traits? Or is it just political? Like, what's the mix of when we economics decide in India, like especially you worked in NITI Aayog. So probably you could give the few examples that occurred, any trade, any smaller trade that happened in your tenure, and how does it is impacting or impacted?
Yeah, I think the first thing we look at is job creation. So we are always looking for creating jobs, livelihoods for people, and we look at trade as an opportunity for that. So rather than getting fixated with the traditional debates of free trade versus protectionism, we say we want trade that works for everyone. We want trade. We are not against trade. Again, we are not for complete free trade. We want trade policy defined in such a way that it helps everyone. Inclusive development, right? So inclusive development is a motivation. So now from that fundamental thought process, what we do is we negotiate with the countries, and the other countries also come with the same objective. They also want to, everyone wants to gain more than what they give away. So,
Yes.
then that's a tough negotiation. We'll say no, we will not open up this sector because this sector is vulnerable to competition from your country. So we won't open up. Then, but then there'll be negotiation points that, okay, if you open up your sector, then we'll consider opening up our sector. So these kind of things happen. Agriculture is typically a main sector that keeps coming up. The developed countries, other countries, they want access to our agricultural markets. They can export. We say no, we want to protect our farmers, so we cannot let you in so easily. When it comes to let's say manufacturing, there are also certain sectors we have like automobiles and so on. We have very strong presence, but we are again, if we have cheaper imports, they'll be affected. So we are
Yes.
very protective of them. But then we always look at the intermediate inputs. Let's say, for example, if you look at some textile industry and so on, some of the chemicals, the synthetic components that come as part of production, some of the resins and so on, they are mostly imported. They're not. We don't have any capacity. Even if you keep our tariffs 100%, 200%, there is nobody to manufacture them. So
Okay.
there, it's easier for us to reduce the tariffs. So we start with those kind of low-hanging fruits, where okay, this has nobody is going to debate it if you reduce the tariffs. So we reduce them. Then we come to the sectors where there'll be debates. Then we'll sit with the industry, ask them, well, why don't you open up? Why don't you have some competition so that later on, when you go to other markets, you'll be competitive. If you're able to compete with this country in the domestic market, then you can go and compete with them in the other markets.
Correct.
So these kind of the discussions we have we have to have the stakeholder discussions with the industry, with the civil society, and then we have negotiations, and finally we decide. But fundamentally, the parameters would be employment, GDP gains, sectoral gains and losses, who gains, who loses, and what will be the trade balance, how much are we going to export, how much are we going to import because of this trade agreement, and all this. And then what are the third country effects? If you are negotiating with one country,
Yeah.
how can you shield yourself from some other country? Let's say, for example, we have created trade with Russia. How can we reduce our dependence on China because of that? So that also is a factor. So all these things, global value chains, and another important thing is, let's say we have a trade agreement with UK, which is now going on. With this trade agreement, what we can do is we'll have an access to the European markets, because UK has just now reached a deal with the EU. So if you're able to access the UK market, you can also access the EU market through that. So the Indian companies can even invest in UK, and then that way they can export to EU. Like you manufacture something, like you manufacture textiles from here, then you export them to UK, you then package them, add some value, then you export to EU, then you'll get all the benefits that UK has in EU, right? So of course there are other complications like rules of origin and so on, but these are kind of things that we do.
So your major emphasis was in job creation. So if you talk about, like, in India with such a high population, the job creation, like what kind of job creation do you guys look at? Like, is it on a high end sector? Like, of course, if I talk about tech industry, it mainly goes to the maybe intelligent students or well educated students or people. But what about other, when you talk about manufacturing, textile, and everything? So, what kind of people or what portion of our society actually get impacted by job creation? Like, how down the government of India
Yeah,
will establish?
yeah, no, definitely. As I mentioned, inclusive development is a focus, right? So if you go to an interesting thing we look at is, if you look at UK market, for example, and look at all the competitors there and how much tariffs they are facing and how much we are facing, you will find that even in a labor-intensive traditional sector like textiles, we face high tariffs,
Okay.
whereas some other countries which have free trade agreements, they have low tariffs. So if we are able to push them to reduce those tariffs, which they are willing to, they'll definitely reduce those tariffs because they don't have any textile industry, so they'll reduce those tariffs. So when they reduce those tariffs, that job creation, that exports and job creation that is going to happen will help the blue collar workers,
Okay.
people who are really in need of jobs, right?
Yes.
So definitely those are the priorities. That is where a lot of negotiation happens. I said, okay, we want our poorer people to, the low skill employees to get jobs. The high skill will automatically happen, like you said.
Yes.
The high
Yes.
skill automatically will happen once you have the market access. But low skill is where we have a lot of negotiation. That's where we have a lot of standstill debate and so on, because both countries will want that. UK also will want their blue collar workers to be saved. We will want our blue collar workers to be saved. But in this example, India, UK, the good thing is there is a lot of complementarity. The kind of blue collar workers in UK are not the same as the blue collar workers in India. So they are different sectors, different focus, different skills. So we can potentially have a good agreement like what we had with UAE and Australia recently. So yeah, definitely jobs across the board, not just the high skill.
If you could give an example about in your tenure, what exactly, if you can quote here, I mean, not publishing some sensitive information, like if you talk about any of your trade that you did on your tenure, which was really not even if it is impacting, if it's happening right now, so it will be great for.
Yeah, no, see, there are agreements on one hand, also facilitating trade.
Okay.
So we did a lot of that kind of work, like how to, when we have trade agreements, many times the exporters don't know that this trade agreement exists, these are the provisions and so on. So we do a lot of those kind of capacity building programs. So
Okay.
we reached out to the industries, we explained them. These are, for example, UAE and Australia, we had the trade deals. So we
What
explained.
was the trade deal between UA, Australia, and India?
So India had a trade deal with UAE separately and Australia separately. So this was actually greater market access to these two countries
Okay.
from India. So we can export pretty much all commodities, zero duty to both countries, both UAE and Australia. And so we have a lot of markets opening up there. So we can export a lot to those countries. Not only goods, but also services. We can even, for example, even migration is easier now. So if you want to go, so all those things have been negotiated. So first of all, we did these negotiations also very, very carefully. During the negotiations, at every stage, we did a lot of analytics, looking at very detailed granular data. Like this particular commodity, UAE is saying that they'll open up so much. We are saying that we'll open up so much. What, how will it affect the industry? What are the industry people saying? Let's talk to the industry people. Let's talk to the industry association. Let's talk to the civil society because there are also environmental, other social impact and so on. So we looked at all these things, and also we want to do it in a speedy way. We cannot keep, many
Okay.
times these trade agreements, they keep, negotiations keep on going for years together. So here we wanted to do it in a time bound way, at the same time bring everyone together. So that is one example how we did that.
So
And
how much time take? Like, what's the time frame?
time was less than a year for
Less
each
than.
of them. For
Okay.
UAE and Australia, less than a year it was done. So that was a very, and also we focused on the low hanging fruit. Let's say, let's first, both countries would agree. Let's focus on things that are no brainers, like we explained in the case of Russia. These are the things that both of us can easily agree upon. then we'll go to the tougher negotiations. When it comes to the tougher parts, we'll have certain asks, they will have certain asks, then we'll see how much we can accommodate, how much they can accommodate, then we'll come up with the deal.
Yeah,
So in all these things, we had a good deal. So from India's side, it was a really good deal because we forced both of them to pretty much reduce all tariffs. Whereas what we did was we reduced certain tariffs. Certain tariffs we still kept relatively high agricultural tariffs and so on. With Australia, dairy is very important, so we kept the dairy tariffs high. And then we also have a rider. You might have heard of rules of origin. So if in order to comply, in order to get these tariff concessions, Australian exporters and UAE exporters, they have to show that their product is made completely in Australia or UAE.
Yeah.
So or 80%, 60%, whatever. So that makes it difficult for them to access our market. So we have these kind of riders, and we have a lot of sensitivities taken into account. So broadly, what I'm saying is, with these deals, we want to get the best out of their markets, and we will give the least from our market, and we want to be open to the extent that their exports can help us. Like from UAE, we can get cheap oil, cheap
Yes.
some other food products like dates. We don't have dates, we can import dates from them. Those kind of things we can reduce the costs here. Others we can we have managed to protect our domestic industry, and that is why if you see in the media also, there has not been so much debate about these, because these are really pretty comprehensively done, well done. So there is not much criticism going on.
So basically, just to summarize, to start with the trade, any government try to first take the low-hanging fruits, which is very speedy and also can impact immediately. And then probably the government also see how the relationship works, and then goes towards the more comprehensive and more detailed trade agreement, right? Probably this is how basic trades function.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, so now we talked about the problems of like comparative and competitive advantages, cheap labor, innovation, and transfer. So, if you could specifically mention few points for people to understand, like what could be the possible way for India to balance, because we, like as a developing country, we cannot go on the extreme sides. We cannot give everything a free trade, and also we cannot protect everything. So what would be the, and considering that India's total export and import of goods services is approximately one third, 33% of GDP in FY22 as per the government data. So what could be the few steps that Indian government should take and has been taking few points to to balance between protectionism and the free trade?
Yeah, actually, one thing is there are many wins, easy and quick wins there. So one thing is, if you take the newspapers and the trade magazines, even if you go to the 1980s and till now, you will see one catchy phrase. It's called inverted duty structure. You'll keep seeing this every day in the Indian newspapers, right? So inverted duty structure means that you are let's say you're producing automobiles. For your automobiles, uh, this is not a real example. I'm just giving you a random example because in reality, in this situation, it's different. This is one of the few sectors where the inverted duty structure doesn't exist. But I'm just giving you for understanding purposes. So let's say the automobiles producer faces very high competition from imports because the tariffs are low. At the same time, if they want to import engines and parts, uh, for them the tariffs are very high. So for them the input costs are high. So what does it mean? You are a producer. You are facing tough competition from imports because your tariffs are low, whereas your inputs that you want to get from outside, you don't have inside.
That's a high tariff.
You pay high tariffs. So what does it mean? For inputs there are high tariffs. For output you have low tariffs. So you have a double whammy. You have a double negative effect. So that really hurts the industry. This is there in many industries, and government has been fixing little by little, but a very random, very major, radical change is required here.
1 minute, sir, just to explain. So you're talking that, so if, for example, hypothetical example, if someone is producing a phone, so you are saying that if I'm producing the X phone, so the same kind of phone, the finished product is getting imported in the Indian market with a low tariff, right? But when we are manufacturing the phone, the input goods that is required, maybe chip and everything, that is basically have a high tariff.
Yeah,
So we are getting crushed in a both ways. I mean, we have a direct competition for the our finished product, and also we are getting more input, like the high cost input. So ultimately
exactly,
the cost is going to be high, and we will of course not able to compete the finished product with the, yeah, okay, got it, this is.
exactly. And in the automobile example, we actually have done well because automobiles, cars, and motor vehicles have high tariffs, 60% and so on. And engines parts, they have very low tariffs, like 10%, 12%. So that is a good example where it is positively, eliminated. The inverted duty structure doesn't exist. But there are many other sectors like textiles and so on where you have this problem.
Problem.
So that there is it's a pure pragmatism. It is not about free trade or protectionism. And this is something that everyone will agree. Let us just reduce these tariffs. And many times this is done only because of some procedural gaps and for revenue purposes. So this can easily be rectified. This is one thing where there is no debate. Like both extremists will agree. If you're a free trader or if you're a,
Yeah, of course, it's
you
better
will
for
agree that,
countries,
yeah,
yeah.
you will agree that yes, if you're not producing something, I want it to be low tariff. If
Yeah,
I'm producing something, let me have high tariff. So that something is agreeable upon. So I think this can be done fairly easily. The second thing we can do is when we negotiate with other countries for free trade agreements and so on, we can be discriminant. We should not completely say that, okay, for me, agriculture is important, so I'll not even reduce tariffs on it. But you look at the country, let's say Switzerland or UK or some of these countries. Are they going to export rice to you? No.
no, no.
So don't even negotiate about it. You just tell them we are going to make rice zero tariff. If you are able to produce basmati rice and export to us, do it. They're not going to do it, right? So I'm just giving an example. Maybe I may be wrong. I'm not an agricultural expert. Maybe British can crop, develop basmati and export. I don't know. But what I'm saying is find out those kind of products which they can never manufacture, and automatically you reduce the tariffs. So that gives us like a negotiating strength. I've reduced tariffs here. These are sensitive sectors, but I've reduced tariffs. Why don't you reduce tariffs on your sensitive sectors? So
Okay,
this is like it's almost like a game theory. Like if you do something radical, they'll also do something radical in return. So I think that kind of approach should be there. We have to also other thing is you think about discriminate between the exporters, right? So like I told you earlier, if you think of UK and China, let both of them are exporting the same thing. Let's say then if you have freer trade with UK, then you are going to become more dependent on UK, but less dependent on China. So
okay,
from a geopolitical perspective, China is a bigger evil for you. Then it's kind of a good diversion to have away from China towards UK. So I think these kind of thought processes can help. And I think in all this, a lot of analytics has to be done. So if you do more and more analytics, then you become more objective minded and you are not stuck to the ideologies. So I think that is more important. We need more and more analytics done, more and more discussions, stakeholder discussions. Do the analytics, talk to the stakeholders, uh, and I think then we can move forward. And also we can have a spirit of partnership with other countries rather than competition. If you think of them as competitors, then things may not work. So, but you have to design these agreements from a perspective of partnership.
got it.
That like the chips example you said, you can have maybe in India now we have a lot of rare earth critical minerals deposits found. So now we can mine them and then export to other countries, friendly countries, and they can then export, process it and export as some part, and then we can manufacture chips. No, we can keep doing, like you can take advantage of the U.S. Chips Act. U.S. has this Chips Semiconductors Act, and you have this Inflation Reduction Act. So take advantage of that rather than complaining that this is not working for us. Say, okay, set up some investment in US, which can take something from India, then manufacture something. So we have to be very, the private sector also has to be very intelligent, but the government also has to guide them. See, this, let's take advantage of these things in these countries. And we can have a, anyway, we have a very fragmented global value chain. We should think beyond trade. think in terms of global value chains. So it's not a zero sum game. It's not like, okay, I'm exporting this, you're importing this.
Yeah.
You're exporting this, some small part, and that is being added value. Then it comes back to you. Then you export to somewhere else, and then by the time the end product happens, many stages of value addition are there, and you can add value to many stages. If you're more open to the imports, you will also get more and more opportunity to export in different parts of the value chain.
Got it. So very first thing is it should be data driven. I mean, whatever the presumption has been might change because of data is saying might be saying something else. And second, maybe like revising the previous trade agreements that has happened among the countries to see like what are the gaps are there, like we talked about the inverted duty structure gaps. So
Yeah,
okay.
absolutely.
I think that's great, sir. I think our viewers and audience will get to know more about trade, and of course, you have used some, I would say, more of a technical words in terms of for people to understand. I will try to define it and make it as simple as that for audience to listen. So, thank you so much for joining, sir, for this the call. Thanks. Hope
Thank you. Thank
people
you.
get to benefit from it. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you.